Today on the Diabetes Podcast.
Insulin is a very important signaling hormone, not just for glucose. It's one of the most important signaling molecules in your entire body, and it talks to way more than just your muscles and your liver. Insulin talks to your skin, it talks to your brain, of course, and it talks to your ovaries. Insulin in normal amounts actually help support healthy ovary function. The question is what happens when the ovary is hearing from way too much insulin.
Hello and welcome to the Diabetes Podcast. I'm Richie.
And I'm Amber.
And Amber, today we haven't done this in a while. We're talking about something I know nothing about. Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome. Is that correct?
We haven't talked about something you know nothing about in a while. Okay.
Did I say that right?
Sure. Sure. We're talking about Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome, and a theme through last episode, which was gestational diabetes, and this is that this is sort of a continuation of something that can be going on in the background that you don't really know about. And one of the big ideas is that it's not where the story starts necessarily, but it's a continuation that could potentially progress to type 2 diabetes. And that's why we talk about this on the Diabetes Podcast, because this is something happening with metabolism and it can affect your reproduction. So we like to talk about it. Here it go. So if you remember last podcast, we used the analogy of a 5-gallon bucket. And we discussed how some women start with an empty 5-gallon bucket and start their pregnancy with an empty 5-gallon bucket. And some start their pregnancy with a half full 5-gallon bucket. And kind of what determines whether that woman might develop gestational diabetes is, does that bucket overfill towards the middle to end of pregnancy?
Or to kind of, I guess, dumb it down even further, are you starting your pregnancy with some degree of insulin resistance already, that the increased insulin resistance, the naturally occurring increased insulin resistance of a factor of 2 to 3 is going to push you over the edge?
Right. Yep. That is correct. Will it overflow? And so that's not because anybody did anything wrong. It's not some kind of moral failure. It's just that the body's been quietly compensating for something for quite some time before anybody sort of knew to look for anything. And so I want to talk about one of the most common reasons why somebody might start their pregnancy with the bucket half full, and that's polycystic ovarian syndrome. And in many ways, it is the prequel to gestational diabetes. And this matters if any woman is thinking about pregnancy at all. It's incredibly common, and that's the main reason why we want to talk about it, because it's one of the most common hormonal conditions of women in reproductive years. And I think it might also be one of the misunderstood and one of the most underexplained conditions that's out there. Because I'm a diabetes educator and because I believe that healthcare is not as proactive as I would like to see, normally if I am talking to a woman about polycystic ovarian syndrome, it's not when they have polycystic ovarian syndrome. Many times it's when they have gestational diabetes, and even more times it's when they have type 2 diabetes and they tell me that they had gestational diabetes or they had polycystic ovarian syndrome long before their diagnosis of type 2. So unfortunately, I don't get people as proactively as I would like, which is why I really wanted to talk about how insulin resistance can play a role as early as polycystic ovarian syndrome. And we'll talk about which came first, the insulin resistance or the polycystic ovarian syndrome, and how this all plays a role. So oftentimes women tell me about when they were in their 20s or 30s and they might have had some teenage acne, except they're in their 30s, and maybe some male pattern type hair loss, not baldness, but like some receding hairline, different things like that, or hair where they don't want it, that is more of a masculine type facial hair pattern. And they might have been trying to get pregnant for longer than most. It might have been more challenging for them, and perhaps been gaining a little more weight than they desired. I mean, a lot of women can probably relate to this, especially around the midst of women and men, but we're talking about PCOS, so we'll stick with the women in this story. So a lot of people are like, I'm not really doing anything different, and I've started gaining weight. So what's going on? And so what I understand to be true is usually people will get an ultrasound and they might see what appears to be like little cysts on the ovaries, and they get this diagnosis, and usually they'll get a prescription for birth control and a prescription for metformin. Those tend to be like the two things that are handed out, and they get a sentence from their healthcare provider on lifestyle and diet, which usually goes by the way of just lose a little weight.
Exercise more.
Yep, just lose some weight.
Yeah.
And so I just imagine this person who's told that walks out to their car and is just like, what the heck just happened? Like, I came because I had these symptoms and I was told to lose more weight and exercise. And while some of the women told that could probably lose some small percentage, and it only takes about 5 to 10% of weight loss to improve insulin sensitivity, but other women might appear very slender and not think that there's much fat to lose. And that also has to do genetically with where you store fat on your body. Do you tend to store it more around your midsection? And there's also some genetic component of polycystic ovarian syndrome. So it would be like, I would be remiss to say that everyone with PCOS has insulin resistance, but insulin resistance is present in most women with PCOS. So it's like with your Venn diagram, you have all women, and then insulin resistance and PCOS overlap very much in that space. So you have the insulin resistance Venn diagram circle, and then you have PCOS, where maybe 80% of the PCOS circle is overlapping with the insulin resistance circle. So it's the same experience, I think, that really hurts me to hear as the last podcast, that there's not a lot of guidance given other than just lose some weight. And it's not necessarily the most helpful advice out there. And I don't think that it's explained very well, especially in terms of insulin resistance and the role of insulin resistance in this condition. So it's kind of like that, the fact that they are struggling to potentially lose weight could be the very thing that's contributing to the PCOS in the first place. They're struggling to do this thing that's creating the condition, that then they tell them the cure is to do the thing that they're struggling to do. So anyway, physiology is physiology, and it doesn't judge you. There's no moral standing with that. It just explains what's going on. So when you understand what's happening with PCOS, hopefully then the shame will, if there was any, hopefully there isn't, but that will start to dissolve. And because it didn't come from bad behavior, it's just what's happening. So let's talk about sort of the normal state, normal physiology, before we go into what's happening with PCOS. So you have the menstrual cycle. I am not an OBGYN. I am not a pro at explaining the menstrual cycle. I've experienced many menstrual cycles, but I'm going to do my best. Okay. So every month you want to think about this conversation back and forth between insulin and the ovaries because they talk. So every month your brain sends a hormone signal that basically says to the ovaries, hey, let's get a few eggs ready. And inside your ovaries, you have these fluid-filled sacs called follicles, and each follicle is housing an immature egg. So at the start of the cycle, you get a little group of these follicles that start to develop, kind of like runners at the start of a race, and they're all growing, they're all maturing. And as they grow, they begin to produce estrogen. And normally, one follicle will pull ahead in this race, and that's called the dominant follicle. And once it's mature, there's this surge of a hormone called the luteinizing hormone.
What? One more time?
Luteinizing hormone. Okay. And that surge is the starting gun, if you will. That's ovulation, that's where the dominant follicle releases the egg available for fertilization and so on and so forth. So out of this whole group, basically you have the one that wins, and the others that didn't win, they just fade into the background. They recede, bow out gracefully. And the follicle that released the egg, it becomes the temporary structure that produces progesterone, which prepares the body in case that egg gets fertilized. And if it doesn't, the hormones drop, you have a period, and the whole conversation starts over again next month. And so it's basically this cycle of someone gets selected and then gets released. If nothing happens, reset, tries again. And it's this incredibly coordinated dance between the brain and insulin and the ovaries and hormones rising and falling at exactly the right time. So when this works, it's pretty seamless. You don't think about it. You don't manage it. It happens. And your body's just running this complex monthly orchestration without anything untoward. It just happens like breathing. So now we'll talk about when a voice in that conversation gets too loud. So what if I told you that one of the hormones controlling ovulation is not a hormone at all?
Do tell.
So we always talk about insulin on the podcast, right? And we almost always talk about it in one context: blood sugar. So we talk about how insulin is the key that unlocks the door to the cell and lets the carbohydrate food go into the cell and make energy. So we said that so many times, but insulin is a very important signaling hormone, not just for glucose. Like, that's a huge role that it has, but it's one of the most important signaling molecules in your entire body. And it talks to way more than just your muscles and your liver. Insulin talks to your skin. It talks to your brain, of course, and it talks to your ovaries. So the ovary has insulin receptors on it, and the ovary is listening to insulin. And in normal amounts, that's completely fine. It's part of normal function. Insulin in normal amounts actually help support healthy ovary function. So that's normal physiology. The ovary is supposed to be hearing from insulin. So the question is, what happens when the ovary is hearing from way too much insulin? And way too much insulin all the time. We have a word that we talk about that often on the podcast, which is hyperinsulinemia, which is just more circulating insulin levels in the blood, which is driven part of insulin resistance. So it's exactly when insulin resistance, the way that it works is your cells are becoming less responsive to insulin. When that happens, what does the pancreas do?
When insulin happens, or
when there's insulin resistance, what does the pancreas do?
Insulin resistance, the pancreas increases the amount of insulin that releases, trying to overcome the
overcome. Exactly. It releases more to try to overcome the resistance. So you have higher circulating insulin, even the same thing talking to the ovary. So the blood sugar could still look very fine at this stage of the excess insulin, which is why we recommend the fasting insulin levels get checked to see that. So the liver in your body tends to turn the volume down. So normally when you have this resistance and more insulin is being made, the other organs have those headphones on, right? Like the teenagers with the headphones on. But in insulin resistance, in this case, the ovaries don't have headphones and the insulin signal is just loud and they don't really turn the volume down. It listens at full volume. And so we have the ovaries getting shouted at by insulin all day, all night. And so when this happens and the ovary is exposed to all this insulin, it signals it to do two things, and both of them lead in the same direction. So first, the insulin signals certain cells in the ovary called theca cells to produce.
Can you spell that?
THECA.
Okay.
Theca, or maybe theca. I think it's theca cells to produce more androgens. And androgens are our hormones. The most important for females tend to be testosterone. And so I want to be very clear that women also make testosterone. It's completely normal and healthy. You're supposed to have some, and women make and need androgens, and normal levels of androgens do things like contributing to the libido, keeping the healthy bone mass, making sure you keep your muscle mass, and it's also can be an estrogen precursor. So the issue in PCOS is not androgens, it's the amount. The insulin is telling the ovary, make more, and now you've got more androgens in the system than it's designed to handle. So the first thing, the ovary itself makes more testosterone through the process we just described, through the insulin yelling, make more, make more, make more. But the second thing that is I would say equally as important is that your liver produces a protein, and it's called sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG. And I want you to think of SHBG like a chaperone to the testosterone. So if a hormone is attached to SHBG, it's not freely available to interact with cells. So you can think of testosterone as like this. If you get too much testosterone in one place, things can go bad. So you need chaperones. So this SHBG is a chaperone to this. So high insulin levels tell the liver to make less SHBG. So you have less chaperones available for the free testosterone. And so you have the ovary making more testosterone because of the insulin, and you have the liver making fewer SHBC chaperones because of the insulin. And so you end up with all of this running amok. And that elevated free androgen is what produces many of the symptoms that we talked about earlier with the acne, especially like a deep jawline acne, the hair growth in a male pattern, the chin, on the upper lip, the hair.
So the analogy that comes to mind is the episode of I Love Lucy, where she's working on the candy assembly line or whatever it is, and they start coming out too fast, then she can put it into the box. So I've got increased insulin telling my ovaries to produce more androgens, while at the same time telling the liver to slow down on the producing the sex hormone binding.
Yeah,
the chaperones,
less chaperones,
sex more crazy,
globulin.
wild testosterones, all out there wilding
out.
Yeah,
that's right. And I think that you have women fighting these, what women might believe are separate cosmetic battles going on, and they're all could be related to PCOS. All right. So now let's dive a little deeper into the ovaries. And I think talking about the fact that this is called Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome is misnamed. I think that when you think of cysts, you often think of fluid-filled sacs, and that's not really what's happening here. At least I used to think this. I used to think there were cysts on people's ovaries that's needed.
What I've always been told.
Yeah, that's what you would think. And I think that name has really done damage to really understanding what's going on. So remember that monthly race that we were talking about? So think of it like you have all your runners in the starting blocks, but instead of just the foot pressed against the starting block, you have those shoe clips that I remember you one time couldn't get your foot out of the shoe clip in time, fell over. So think of it like that, but those shoe clips are glued or bolted in. So you're stuck in the blocks. You cannot get out. So this is really what's happening in this race. Remember, we talked about how one would pull ahead and that one would be the one that got released. So when you have this high androgen, high insulin environment, it disrupts that process, and the follicles are there, but they don't mature properly. So they're all starting to develop. None of them not one gets selected to pull ahead to ovulate. So instead of one winning the race and releasing an egg, you get a bunch of follicles that get stuck. They get arrested partway through development. And so nobody crosses the finish line. They're all just stuck there in the blocks. And historically, people would describe it, healthcare professionals would describe it as looking like a string of pearls. And at some point, somebody called those cysts, but that's not a cyst. It's not a problematic fluid pocket. They're eggs that started to develop and got stuck. And so
this is
it's
just
way more. It's just hormone disruption.
This is just the meme with the girl that trips first thing, getting off the block and falls, and then over herself again. Just everybody's tripping at the starting line, and we're not even worried about finishing the race. We're just hoping they're all okay.
Yep. Yeah. Right. Right. Yes. And so you have this ovary that's sort of the messenger. The ovary is not the problem here. It's the insulin resistance, truthfully. And you could say that the insulin resistance was caused by ultra processed foods or inactivity or visceral fat or all of the things that we've talked about in prior episodes.
I think when we get back far enough, isn't the first criminal in this caper is that kind of chronic low-grade inflammation that precedes everything. It's the ever persistent, non-localized inflammation that results in the insulin resistance that then results in insulin overproduction to overcome the insulin resistance that results in ultimately prediabetes and type 2 diabetes on a long enough timeline.
And yes, and we have podcasts on inflammation.
Oh boy, do we.
All those fun things. So don't shoot the messenger. We need those ovaries. So let's see. I think it's still important to not think of PCOS as a fat disease. Same with prediabetes or...
Again, layperson, the one person I know off the top of my head that has struggled with this, if long-term low-grade chronic inflammation is the ultimate root cause. I know how much you love those words, but this individual hates vegetables. I mean, hates vegetables, has very low intake of the thing that we've talked about as like one of the main means of combating inflammation, combating that gut dysbiosis is a healthy, not just quantity, but variety of whole plant-based foods is kind of the magic bullet for curing a lot of that. If I reduce that for decades, kind of doesn't not necessarily going to be causal, but I would assume with my limited understanding that it would definitely increase the risk of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, that would be, for me, one of the harder clients to have would be somebody who really didn't like eating vegetables. I love it when I have a client for weight loss and they're like, I love vegetables. And I'm like, well, all right, this is going to be much less of an uphill battle. This is going to be completely manageable and something we can make really good progress on. So yes. So I just, going back to like, how do you combat this? I love the fasting insulin level, like seeing that. And that way you're not just guessing, especially if you don't look like you have much weight to lose.
So I got a question. I know, did you say you can have PCOS without elevated insulin levels? Okay. But it's most common with
women who
insulin.
have high insulin levels.
So this would be more just checking to make sure that this is not a side effect of a very common pathology that's happening to a ever increasing portion of the adult population. Okay.
Yep. That's a great way to put it. So in a lot of women, the high insulin is clearly driving the androgen problem. We have really good evidence for that mechanism, the insulin to androgen, the insulin to SHBG link that we just talked about when we were talking about the chaperones and so on. But it can run the other way and become a loop where the high androgens themselves worsen insulin resistance, and you get this self-reinforcing cycle. So that was the part where I talked about like which came first, the chicken or the egg in the beginning, and what I meant by that. So that's this very strong genetic component that can come into play, and PCOS does run in families. So that's what I meant when I said that insulin resistance does not cause PCOS, like full stop, in women. It is a big driver of it in many women, but I wouldn't say that all PCOS, all women. That just wouldn't be what the...
Not accurate.
Exactly. That wouldn't be the most accurate thing to say. Exactly. So...
But again, identifying if you do have elevated fasting insulin would to some degree educate how to treat it.
Yeah, it would tell you that there's a good chance that if you were able to increase the sensitivity to insulin, which one of the most proven ways to do that would be to lose 5 to 10% of body weight. And we talk about how to do that often on this podcast, but for many women, it would be best done on a one-on-one basis with a registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator, like really with a team approach as well, exercise physiologist, physical therapist, any of those things that are needed. And so then the way that PCOS gets diagnosed is a very complex criterion, complex-ish, I would say. So the most common framework is called the Rotterdam criteria. So you diagnose PCOS through it's a disease of elimination, very much like acute myocarditis is a process of elimination. So you need 2 out of 3 things. You need irregular or absent ovulation, signs of high androgens. You could see that either through a blood test, which the most specific one would be high free testosterone, because you would have low SHBG. So then you would have higher unchaperoned testosterone.
The fact that you have elevated testosterone is indicative of not having adequate SHBG. Is that right?
Most likely.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's why, because you have testosterone, you have free testosterone, and the free testosterone would show more those unchaperoned, which would be more indicative of PCOS. And Also, if you had those physical signs like the acne or the hair on your chinny chin chin. And then if you got an ultrasound and had that polycystic appearance on the ovaries. And yeah, so other things could look similar, like thyroid issues or other hormone conditions. And so they have to rule out which one to make sure, because you need two of the three. So two women can both have PCOS and have almost totally different presentations as well. So one could have irregular periods and the cysts, but barely any androgen symptoms. And another can have the acne, the hair, the irregular cycles, but the ovaries look completely fine on an ultrasound. So it's a syndrome, it's a cluster, it's a spectrum, and not a single uniform disease. And I think that contributes to why it's underexplained. Even I learned a lot researching for this podcast, because I've always heard PCOS. So many women who have diabetes later in life will tell me about their struggles with their ability to get pregnant, and then the fact that they had gestational, just all of these things. And occasionally I'll see someone with PCOS, but it's so rare that I haven't really taken the time to learn as much about it as I would like to know, because I haven't had that person. It's like, let me dive into this so I can help you understand it better. Because I've just, like I said, I haven't been in at the ground floor, if you will, for nearly all people, I would say. So I think in terms of what to do about it, I don't want to just say diet and exercise, lifestyle, because that is the answer. However, that's a very loaded word to change your lifestyle and different things. So we just talked about insulin being a very loud voice in the room, driving so much of this. And the single most powerful thing that we can do is turn the volume of that voice down and increase the sensitivity to insulin. But also, if we could do anything to lower the circulating insulin, that would help as well, to give that ovary a more quiet environment to listen to. And the most consistent tools that we have are motion and nutrition. So yes, there's metformin, there is medication, there is birth control, and that's usually what women get, or those two over lifestyle and nutrition kind of things. So I would say nutrition and movement, those are the root, and metformin and birth control are the Band-Aid or the scaffolding, if you will. So for women with PCOS who carry excess weight, the research consistently shows, as it does with prediabetes and so many other things, that a modest amount of weight loss in the range of, so if we're talking about putting type 2 diabetes into remission early on in the diagnosis, we're talking like a 15% reduction in weight loss, 10 to 15%. And with PCOS, it's even less weight loss that you get really great outcomes. And that is looking like 5 to 10%.
But also, it's probably occurring earlier in life. It's probably less. We've talked about this almost ad nauseum. It just takes years and years to build up the adiposity around the organs until it gets to that critical mass. And then stuff starts to go south pretty quick.
You get the avalanche effect. Yep. So for someone that's 200 pounds, for easy math, we're just talking like 10 to 20 pounds of weight loss could be, and that's significant. That's a significant amount of weight loss, truly. But that's like doable, because I think a lot of people, if they are 200 pounds and they go to the doctor, they think, oh, geez, I've got to weigh 125 in order to have these good outcomes. And it just seems insurmountable, like something they could never do. And it's not that much weight loss for really positive benefits in this space. So,
but also probably a good time to beat the drum of anytime we're talking weight loss. If you're talking 10 to 20 pounds, somewhere in there, budget 10 to 20 weeks. That's a reasonable amount of time to make consistent changes to your diet, to consistently move more. And keep in mind that, just like the wedding dress analogy, this is not it. Once you get to the point where you've given your body a break, you've given your pancreas a break by reducing the insulin resistance, you're going to have to keep doing the thing or it will come back. The behaviors that create the environment in which the disease thrives in the first place will absolutely come back if you go back to those same behaviors. Whether it's PCOS, or at least the PCOS that is affected by elevated insulin resistance, or much later the prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, it's the same stuff, and you're gonna have to do it forever. And if you don't like it, I'm sorry, but the behaviors that we talk about every single week on this podcast are the behaviors that are going to enable you not just to live the longest, but to live the healthiest. This chronic disease is not rare anymore. It's becoming normal. Like the normal state for adults, at least in the United States, is that of metabolic disease. And the only way to change that is by doing stuff that's not normal anymore, stuff that will result in the lower levels of insulin resistance and particularly inflammation. I'll get off my soapbox now.
I like it. So then I also want to talk about the leaner woman with PCOS, because for them, the focus would shift more toward less about weight loss and more about the quality of nutrition and their movement. So things that would improve insulin sensitivity that are independent of weight, because you can change the way your body handles insulin without moving the scale one iota. Like you can change that by building muscle, by moving after your meals, by changing the composition of the plate in front of you. Those things are going to make a difference in lean and higher weight women alike. And so no woman is left out of this. Everybody has something to work with.
Got to get them polyphenols, girl.
Yep. So now let's go back to the medication, because most women do get handed metformin. And metformin is a medication that, among other things, could help lower insulin resistance. And you can see mechanistically why it would make sense for a condition as where high insulin is a central player in this. And it does have a role with some women in PCOS, particularly around the metabolic side and some cycle regularity. Not anti-metformin, however, it's not the magic fix for PCOS. And the evidence is really humbling that nutrition, exercise, movement, these things beat metformin every time.
And not just that, I'm just going to go out.
Or I would say, well, as well or better.
Go out on a limb and say that whether you got PCO or type 2 diabetes, at the higher doses, metformin and let's just say intestinal distress are common bedfellows there, that there's probably some less distressful behaviors you can adopt, particularly as it relates to changing your diet. That would, I would exhaust those options first. The horror stories that I've heard do not lend me to want to have to take metformin.
Yes. Diarrhea is the most common, well-known side effect of metformin that can be mitigated by starting at a lower dose and titrating up as tolerated to the maximum dose. I've heard many people who say they've never had that symptom of metformin at all. And I've heard 10 times as many people say that's absolutely right. The biggest symptom I've had. So if you're someone who is able to get an extended release metformin or who doesn't have those side effects of it, great. But it is definitely one to consider. So it's a tool, not the solution. And it could work as support alongside nutrition and exercise, but not as a replacement for them. So it's not like take the pill and you don't have to worry about any of this lifestyle stuff. And I think you would be, if you're a healthcare worker and you just wrote a metformin script or something like that to a woman with PCOS, you would be doing them a huge disservice if you did not really give them hope by the way of their movement and changing the quality of their intake of nutritional foods. So, yeah. So then, you know how I feel about supplements, but I would say if you look online, you're probably going to have the heaviest marketing from Inositol, or myo-inositol would be some of the biggest. And so It's something that's also found in fruits. It's a compound that a lot of healthier foods have as well. And of course, your results from the supplement have been done on small studies, inconsistent. It's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get from a supplement. You definitely would want an independently verified lab if you were to do that. But I mean, they're not going to have the same results as nutrition and exercise or metformin. And metformin's pretty dang cheap. So I would much rather somebody do metformin than a supplement, because you could have lead, you could have other heavy metals, different things in the supplement that are just not regulated. So the foundation is the nutrition and the movement. And I think it's about the way you build your plate. You want half of your plate non-starchy veggies, a little bit of protein, maybe some starchy vegetables on the other half, but mostly complex carbohydrates. And you just anchor those meals with protein and fiber as well, especially fiber. Can go a long way with helping that. So walking after meals, just 5 to 10 minutes of a walk after meals, 15 minutes if you can, would be great. And yeah, I think building and maintaining muscle is so crucial with this condition. Let me add also sleep and stress. We always have to talk about sleep and stress too, because that completely has to do with insulin resistance, inflammation, all those things.
So what are we talking about next week?
So we're going to talk about what actually happens to the baby, but trying to keep the doom and gloom at bay, just really looking at why it's so important without shame, blame, guilt, those sorts of things, but just understanding what could happen and how to mitigate the risk. It's all about risk mitigation and doing something about it, and how the environment in pregnancy can shape a child's metabolic future, and how we make sense of that. And again, without fear or blame, just really infusing a lot of hope into like what you could do to help have the healthiest pregnancy possible and why it's so important.
Awesome. Great. So thanks for tuning in, and thank you for listening to the Diabetes Podcast. Thanks for listening to the Diabetes Podcast. Be sure to tune in next week when we continue part 3 of our 4-part series on diabetes and reproductive health. If you like what you heard, please click that follow or subscribe button. And until next time, take courage. You can do this, and we can help.